Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of this partnership between NAEMT and AIMHI. What does EMS really cost? I'm Chip Decker, the president of AIMHI and the CEO of the Richmond Ambulance Authority, Richmond, Virginia, and welcoming you. And I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel for today. First off, John Washko, the Assistant Vice President, Northwell Health Center for EMS and Director at Large of NAEMT. From up in New York, Rick Lewis, Battalion Chief, South Metro Fire, Colorado. And wait, there's one more. Matt Zavadsky, the President of NAEMT and Chair of the AIMHI Education Committee from Fort Worth, Texas. Is everybody here?
Present.
Yes, we are, sir. Thank you.
Amazing. So I'd like to give a shout out to Zoll for sponsoring this partnership webinar between NAEMT and AIMHI. And there's also a survey question that's going to show up in the chat window. Feel free to answer that. We'd appreciate it if you do. And there it is on the screen also.
And today, if you have a question that you would like to ask, you can do that through the toolbox on the right-hand side, most likely on the right-hand side of your screen. Just click on questions. It will open up. You can type your question into the text box, and it will be sent to our staff and panelists, and we will then share those during Q&A time. Due to the amount of participants, not all questions will be addressed today, but we will have a FAQ section on our websites at NAEMT and AIMHI to address all participants' questions that were not answered.
So I'd like to share a bit about AIMHI. The Academy of International Mobile Healthcare Integration, AIMHI, represents high-performance emergency medical and mobile healthcare providers in the U.S., Canada, and abroad. Member organizations are high-performance systems that employ business practices from both public and private sectors. And by combining industry innovation with close government oversight, AIMHI affiliates are able to offer unsurpassed service excellence and cost efficiency. Matt.
Boy, Chip, you almost sound like one of those guys at the end of a commercial that are trying to get everything in at once.
I think he missed his calling as a radio announcer or something. I don't know.
Yeah, or he could have, been an auctioneer. He did a really good job there. So, thanks everybody. And for NAEMT, you see we've got 72,000 members. One of the most interesting things about NAEMT is our membership is made up of about a third public sector employees, about a third other, so private sector employees, and then a third hospital-based, volunteer, others. So Jonathan and I and the other board members continually sort of have this great dialogue when it comes to making decisions or taking positions, because we've got a very diverse membership, but that also helps us with a lot of the representation that we do. And one of our missions, obviously, is to advance the profession. And part of how we're doing that is partnering with AIMHI, the folks that really get high performance, high value EMS, to bring you this finance series, because we know that a lot of things, in fact, many things that we do, rely on the ability for our systems to be sustainable. So getting a paycheck every other week, or however often you get your paycheck, and being able to have good vehicles and equipment and good clinical capabilities so often is driven by the economics of the system. And as Chip mentioned early on, this is our second in this series. The first webinar, we looked at how EMS is financed. Essentially, where does the money come from? And these are the things that we discussed on the first webinar. If for some reason you missed that webinar, not a problem. We have a link that will be on this presentation, but Melissa has also sent that out through the chat so that you can actually go in, watch, and listen to the recorded webinar. Download the download the materials that were part of that webinar so that you can have it to always keep with you in case you need it. And we'll do the same thing, obviously, with this one. One of the things that Melissa mentioned is we're going to do the FAQs. The FAQs and the answers from the last webinar is also at this link, both for NAEMT, but also if you go to the AIMHI website, there's one there also. And the reason that we're focusing on this is essentially this issue. This is a depiction of the MedStar system here in Fort Worth. And as you can see, the ability for EMS systems to generate actual dollars to keep lights on, to keep people paid, is becoming a little bit more and more difficult. Over the course of the last couple of decades, you can see the red line for the MedStar system here in Fort Worth is our expense per transport. The blue line is our revenue per transport. And as you can see, in the last few years, those numbers are narrowing. So as a profession, and I can tell you that, Jonathan, you've probably seen the same thing, Rick, you're seeing the same thing, we need to make sure that we can make the systems as economically efficient as possible. And there's two parts to that. One we covered last time, which was the revenue side. This time we're going to talk about the cost and what are the cost drivers of EMS systems. And we're going to cover each and every one of these things throughout the course of the webinar. And Jonathan and Rick and I and Chip, to some extent, are going to depict some of the things that are the cost drivers and explain for the field practitioners, for others in the systems, what do these things really mean and how do these aspects of our service delivery drive cost? We're going to start with response times. And response times, average versus fractile, system-wide versus district, are the things that we're going to talk about. Jonathan, do you want to first walk us through how response times could be calculated, how they are calculated?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And, we're experiencing a lot of the similar challenges that I think you and many others are on the phone, as we've seen changes in our payer mix and our, our cash in the door with expenses rising and those two lines narrowing. And in some instances, I know agencies that are having a crossover point where they're having some significant challenges. And, one of the things that always comes up in that is, well, what's there to cut if we can't get more revenue? And sometimes people talk about service as, one of the driving factors, and it absolutely is. And we'll get more into that, response times and the cost of response time reliability is a major driver in an EMS system. And so we first thought we'd start with how are response times measured, and this really goes back. There's two trains of thought out there. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, kind of before we knew any better, and before the work of Jack Stout, many people averaged their response time. So, and if you look at mathematically what average actually means, it's basically the middle of the bell curve, right? Meaning that essentially half of your calls are less than that number and half of your calls are greater than that number. And that's important to understand because oftentimes it can be extremely misleading number to say, well, my average response time is only 8 minutes, we're doing a great job. Well, understand what that actually means. And oftentimes the audiences that we're speaking to may not fully understand or appreciate, well, that means only half the time you were there within 8 minutes or less. Let's go to the next slide, Matt. So the other way of measuring response times are what are known as fractal measurements, or looking at a reliability standard. And so in this example, we see that 90% is actually at 13 minutes, but reporting an average of 8 minutes. And why is that important? Well, that means that 9 times out of 10, and so when we talk about service reliability, when we talk about average, we're talking about roughly 50% of our patients, and we're talking about fractal response times. In this case, we're looking at the 90th percentile. That means that we're performing at 13 minutes. So that means 9 times out of 10, we're reaching someone within 13 minutes in this particular EMS system, with 10% farther or beyond that 13-minute standard. And that's important, again, to understand, because they're two very different things. And when we talk about service reliability, I often like to understand, okay, well, if I'm at 8 minutes, where is that fractally? And so an 8-minute average in this case, often what I've experienced is oftentimes close to double at the 90th percentile. In this case, it's just slightly less than double at 13 minutes.
So John, let's use an exact scenario. So let's say that Above Average EMS is the name of the organization, and let's say that they do 100 calls a day, and they have a fractile requirement of 8 minutes flat. So at 8 minutes and 1 second, they're late. How many calls can they be late to in that 24-hour period and still be in compliance?
In that case, it's 10, right, out of 100 calls. So they could be late 10 times out of 100 versus if we were reporting, 50%, obviously that's 50 calls. So there's a huge difference there in performance in terms of how many patients are actually receiving that above average, as you would call it, in EMS service.
So you could say that in a system where you have 100 responses a day that have to meet a response time criteria, in this example of 8 minutes, that the system runs with an 8-second tolerance, meaning that if you're 1 second late for 10 calls, you're out of compliance. So you only have 10 seconds to play with.
Yeah, that's not normally how it works, but yes, you could absolutely say that. But it's really about, again, trying to get to a majority of our patients within that 8-minute standard. And on most bell curves, you'll actually see performance. There's only a small number of calls that are usually a few seconds late, and then they go into, greater than that for a variety of reasons based on the system design.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Good examples?
Yeah. So here we're looking at actually understanding a little bit more about the math, right, and understanding the difference between the average response time. In this case, we're adding up 6 responses in this case, looking at the dispatch time to arrival time, and measurement of response time is a whole separate issue as to when the clock actually starts. I think for the most part we have consensus on when the clock actually stops in most EMS systems. Usually it's once the vehicle arrives in front and is placed in park when you read most contracts, or at the reported address if it's a vehicle accident on a freeway, something like that. And then we measure the difference between the start time, in this case dispatch, and arrival time, and that gives us our response time. We add those numbers up in this case and divide by 6, and that's going to give us an average response time of 8 minutes and 53 seconds. When looking at the 90th percentile, there's a couple of different ways mathematically to do this, but we're looking and basically sorting these from the quickest time to the longest time, and then mathematically deriving what the 90th percentile in this case is, which in this system is 13 minutes and 39 seconds when looking at the same number of responses and the performance associated with those responses.
So Rick, in Colorado where you are, if you have a certain response time that you're trying to achieve, how does that drive the cost of service delivery?
Well, in our deployment model, where it's a fixed deployment, then that becomes stations or infill stations to achieve those goals. The difference being without being able to have dynamic staffing models, or at least not as flexible staffing models. It does make it tougher to achieve those goals, especially when geography, our district is 300 square miles served with 30 stations. So some are a much longer travel time back to the hospital and out of service time than those in the core.
You would have to add more unit hours in order to achieve the local goal of a certain response time standard, given geography, population density, time on task, those types of things. So the tighter the response time criteria, the more cost in personnel and equipment that you're going to have on duty in order to achieve that. Is that reasonable?
That is, and because it is a fixed deployment, then we try to make that up on the back end, and we're very fortunate here that we don't have any wall time. So there's a 7-minute ticker after the units arrive at the hospital. They're essentially placed in service right then. 7 minutes being when dispatch puts them back in, but the idea is to be able to keep the throughput of the system, or the surge capacity, increasing the minutes of availability, and get the units back into their first due.
John, did you hear what he said? A 7-minute return to service time automatically when they arrive at the hospital. What's your hospital drop times like in Syosset for your system?
That's funny. I wish we could do that. You know, we have, I wouldn't say we have the worst wall times in the world here, but on average we run between 20 and 30 minutes to drop a patient off, and that's honestly because of you know, significant capacity challenges in the New York City region, with most hospitals constantly being full and overflowing, quite honestly, from in their inpatients back into their ED with numerous ED holds, and then it then backflowing itself, impacting the EMS system. So he's lucky. I wish we had that problem to contend with, because we have significant issues with task times here, as well as wall time, drop times, things like that, response time challenges because of the urban density and traffic issues, that type of thing.
Yeah. So for the participants on the webinar, in your systems, think about the time that you spend at the scene, either at the scene of a call, we'll get to that in a second, but at the hospital, and every minute that you're there at the hospital with a patient waiting to transition care into the hospital emergency department, that's lost unit hour, that's lost productivity. Someone has to fill that gap, and that gap gets filled with more resources, which means more time. So when those field supervisors and the operations manager are contacting you saying, hey, you've been at the hospital for 90 minutes, what's going on? Or like often happens in some systems, you'll get a text message from the dispatch center that says, well, what, are you getting your mail there now? You've been there so long? That's why, is they're trying to make more units available to help balance the workload of the rest of the group. Now, John, there's also a couple of different ways to measure response time. So you could do it like Rick does in South Metro, or like MedStar does, where it's our entire system. But there are some examples where you may have actual districts within the area that you're servicing that need to have a specific response time. How does that impact resource availability and cost?
Yeah, it actually drives things way up, and that's one of the challenges I know that a lot of folks speak to when a community decides to design an EMS system. And understand it from the perspective of the procurer, or the community that's purchasing the ambulance service, or is contracting with, or is looking to, fund a budget, whether you're third service or fire service, is, response time parity, and the concept that, everyone within a community should get a certain level of service, no matter where they live in the community, no matter the socioeconomic situation of that portion of the community, and so on. And so a lot of communities have moved into the concept of response time parity, and that's where you can have many different geographic districts. In this example here, for each one of these little numbered isochrones or response areas or service areas within the larger service area could have a response time standard associated with it. And there's a lot of challenges associated with it. I've been involved in these kinds of situations throughout my career. Very difficult systems to try to meet a certain response time standard for, and quite honestly, it drives the cost up because the number of calls you can respond to for the system, let's say, is 100,000. Then you break it up into these 70 or 80 groups, and it quickly drops down to 5 to 10 calls, probably in certain districts per month. Meaning now you can only have one late, or if you're under 10, you can't have any late, right? And so that significantly impacts the number of units you need to have, or stations you need to have, in order to meet a response time reliability requirement. The other challenge you have in some instances, it can be next to impossible sometimes to meet a standard based on how strict it can be. If you're only doing 10 calls a month, again, it means you can be late on one. And because in our business we rely on machines and people, machines break and people make mistakes. So your ability to every time hit that 9 out of 10 time standard can be very challenging. And double in some cases. I've been in some systems where some of the most stringent response time geographic standards out there, where the doubling the number of ambulance unit hours needed to respond to a geographic region versus if they took the system as a whole at a 90% standard. So significant impact.
So Rick, in your system, you've got sort of a unique model, and you've got communities that are joining South Metro Fire on a fairly regular basis. Talk to us about when a community joins your organization, talk about do they adopt a system-wide standard? How does that work in South Metro Fire's example?
So the first part of your comment is correct. So they adopt the same standards, or it's all under the same accreditation standards. But the challenge becomes typically the reason why mergers occur is there's an inequity on one side or the other, and that the merger itself takes slack out of one side of the system and increases it to the other side to try to plane out that difference. And it becomes really challenging when you're adding on geography that, quite frankly, a lot of it is you can't get there from here. There's not a clear access from one side of the district to the other. So it requires us to rethink where stations are located. And essentially what we do is run all the, in this case, 2018 data through every node possible in our district. And that node includes every station, whether it currently has a medic unit or not, and then look at that predictive analysis to see where those medic units should be now to capture the bulk of those calls within the accepted timeframes.
Excellent, thank you. And John, can we go back to something you said? Isochromic, is that the term that you use? We might need to Google that.
That was a sweet term, by the way. I wrote that down.
I believe those are called isochrones, is the actual technical name of the shape when you're doing it on a GIS system, if I'm not mistaken.
Leave it to John Washko to know that, right? I mean,
of course.
It's like, he's brilliant. So
the nerd in the bow tie would know something like that, and other stupid things you probably have no idea you wanted to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so folks, what you're hearing from Rick, Jonathan, to some extent myself, is this concept of productivity. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it also has an impact on the cost of service delivery. So when you have a faster response time requirement, that means that you have to have more resources available to respond more quickly. And this is something that Rick and Jonathan and Chip and a bunch of folks talk about, especially now with some of the Medicare work going on around cost reporting and this concept of cost of readiness and having the resources available to meet a local community standard. And part of that measure is what we refer to oftentimes as unit hour utilization. Some people may know what that is, but for folks that don't, this is a measure of productivity. And many systems use this to determine how efficiently are we using the resources that we have available in a method that produces, in many cases, revenue. This is used a lot in the ambulance industry. The AIMHI folks use it quite a bit. The NAEMT folks use it quite a bit because we really want to measure how productive are the units being in doing revenue-generating activity. The basic math is that you're going to take the number of unit hours produced, we'll talk more about that in a second, and divide that by the number of transports or billable services that you do for typically a defined period. That could be a day, a year, whatever criteria that you're going to use. So let's
ET3 is going to throw a curveball in that definition because now you've got treat in place. So we're going to have to go and refine all of our definitions that we've used for the past 30 years.
Right, because you're going to have revenue generated from a non-transport.
Correct. That's right.
So for a long time, and we actually do this in the example that we're going to use here, is that we calculate two different unit hour utilizations, one based on responses and one based on actual transports. And historically, the response unit hour utilization tends to be higher for two reasons. One, you typically don't transport everybody to the hospital. Two, sometimes those times on task for a non-transport can be shorter than the true cycle time or the task time for a transport to the hospital, especially the transition of care once you arrive at the destination, etc. But again, as Jonathan pointed out, that could change because now under the ET3 model, you're going to do treatment in place, and jury is still out on whether or not the treatment in place time on task is going to be different than the time on task had you just taken that person to the hospital. But let's look at, for the participants, just some quick calculations. So this is above average EMS, introduced to you at the last webinar. And let's say that they do 3,000 transports a year. They staff one unit 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 27 times 365, 24 times 365 gets you that 8,760 unit hours. So when you divide 3,000 by 8,760, you get a unit hour utilization of 0.342. Now, in the simplest definition, you could say that about 34% of the time that a unit is on duty for above average EMS, they are on a revenue producing transport, or as Doug Hooten always reminds us, the opportunity to generate revenue doesn't mean that you're going to generate revenue from that call.
I love that.
And then same thing for responses. So to Jonathan's point earlier, if we did it based on responses, you're going to have a 3,822 responses divided by that 8,760, or a 0.436 unit hour utilization. 43.6% of the time they are on a call, and then 34% of the time they're actually transporting someone, potentially generating revenue. Now let's say that nothing changed in the system, but above average EMS wanted to add another 24/7 ambulance to their mix. Call volume doesn't change, transport volume doesn't change. What does change is the number of staffed unit hours. It goes from 8,760 to 17,520, and look what happens to the unit hour utilization. It gets cut in half, and that's what you'd expect. So this shows that level of quote unquote busyness, or the level of activity, and depending on your payer mix, your revenue mix, some people will say you have to achieve a certain unit hour utilization in order to balance the books. John, you do a lot of work not only in Northwell, but across the country. In a typical urban, suburban EMS system with an average payer mix, what generally is the benchmark for a UHU that will likely generate enough revenue to keep the system books balanced?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, Matt, and it is all over the board based on many different variables like payer mix and things like that. But I'd say in general in the mid threes, about a 0.35 to 3.6, 3.4, in that range is where there's basically a sweet spot where you try to balance, the financial sustainability of the organization along with employee well-being, so you don't overwork your staff, as well as then provide good quality, reliable patient care from a response time standard, equipment, standard of care, those types of things. And that seems to be the range that I've borne witness to, I guess you could say, in the career that I've had. It's right around that range. Some systems are much higher than that. Some systems are much lower than that. Obviously, geography, urban density, call volume, all of that can play a huge factor in that, as well as EMS system design. So you could take the exact same community with two different EMS system designs and with very different unit hour utilizations, and obviously get very different sustainability discussions or requirements for subsidy versus non-subsidy based on how you do your staffing model and your deployment.
And John, would you go ahead? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to add that's the methodology is sound. But it does make the fire departments that are trying to benchmark against it when they're using a dual role unit, that oftentimes they shy away from it because it would be sometimes, really difficult to hit those high threes with all the responses. And so I would just add for the people that are new to using it, that it can also be a very important factor just to benchmark within your own organization and determine what's busy and what's most efficient, and set that mark there prior to looking around you before you decide whether you're efficient or not.
Yeah, and actually in a station-based, to that point, in a station-based model, taking this measurement down to each individual station, right, and looking at the number of hours and transports, because you'll find probably a high amount of disparity between stations, and I think most of us know this. It's the busier stations, and then I guess some call them the retirement stations, right? In many communities, right? And so doing that type of analysis can also help you understand some of the impact of the design and what it's having financially, but also operationally impact on your staff.
And it could also be said that that's one of the things that Medicare took into account when they established a much higher payment rate for the super rural Medicare reimbursement. because they know that the utilization tends to be low, the task times are very long, so the revenue that they need to generate from that needs to be a little bit higher because their cost of providing that service is much higher because their utilization is lower, but they have that cost of readiness factor still built in. So very important. Here's an example for the audience of a project that we're actually working on right now. And this is a system, I won't identify where it is so that we don't breach any confidentialities here, but this is a system that is considering adding a 5th ambulance to their mix. And you'll see that for 2017 and 18, 19, and even for the beginning of 2020, 1920, they've had 4 ambulances on duty, so they're generating 35,000 unit hours. This is their actual transport volume. Here's the projected transport volume based on some projections that we've done based on past trends in response volume and some community demographics. Notice that when they're staffing 4 ambulances, the cost to the system for that is about $6.7 million. Adding one more 24/7 resource increases their cost to $8.8 million. The revenue difference is not significant because there's only about a 200 per year call difference projected. So in this particular system, by adding that 5th ambulance, it drops their unit hour utilization, to Jonathan's point earlier, from 0.27 to 0.22. And in this model, that system would be upside down by about $1 million a year. And they would have to figure out how are they going to subsidize that additional cost. Right now, the system is essentially breaking even. If they add that 5th unit, now they go into deficit spending. They're either going to have to ask the taxpayers to do that through an increased tax levy, because they're not going to generate more call volume just because they added more resources. So here's an exact example about how that looks when you talk about the number of resources, the cost that it generates in the system for really not too much change in their unit hour utilization. Rick, John, any comments about this concept?
I think this goes to the point too of UHU and its financial, using it as a financial measure. You know, Jack Stout used to say that 1/100th change in a UHU. So, for example, you're going from a 0.27 to a 0.22. That's 5/100ths change, right? Each 100 is worth about $1 million, or you know, and that varies over different systems. But in this case, it's about a $2 million difference per 0.05 change in productivity. Or a 0.05 change here. And so it's important to understand that those small nuances and changes have very large, typically have large tickets attached to them in terms of productivity. And so, for example, if you moved it the other direction and went from a 2.7 to a 2.9, you likely would have seen a precipitous drop, in maybe not expense, but here you're not showing margin, but if there's an operating margin associated with this business, you'd see a change or a reduction in subsidy.
Yep.
And I would also add that sometimes it looks very attractive if you've given away or had mutual aid cover 500 transports or something of that nature, and thinking that if I add an extra unit that I could capture those. And first of all, that never works. We all know that they're never at the perfect place at the perfect time. But even when you take a fraction of those, when you go back and look at what the potential revenue is versus what that outlay is, that they would have to be extremely productive to make that initial investment of putting that new rig on in place.
Great point. I see people chase volume all the time in this business. I think that's an older mantra. In the past, I think we used to say volume cures everything. And at this point, I think we really have to take a huge step back at that, because it's paying volume, first off, solves many problems. But also it comes down to how you operate your business. It's 2 factors there.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so guys, we've talked about the big cost driver of response times and personnel to a large extent. Let's move now to the next section, which is essentially looking at how you deploy those resources and going from a fixed, to a large extent, a fixed or a static system as compared to a flexible system. So, John, walk us through the McDonald's scenario that we see here on the screen.
Yeah, real quick, if you could go to the prior slide real quick, Matt, before we jump into this. And I think this will help people really understand the McDonald's slide a little bit better. And this is something I always like to talk with folks about. Your number one expense in pretty much every EMS system I've ever seen, I don't think there isn't one out there that this is the case, is always going to be pay. And in this case, in this example, 50 or 72% of the operating budget is pay and payroll related. Just for us looking at our numbers, 50% of our budget is salaries, 22% fringe, so we're at 79% for the cost of labor. 79%, our next largest expense is repairs and maintenance, down at 2.4%. So in this case, medical supplies is a little higher here in this system. Our medical supplies are way down the line, like around 1.4, 1.5% of our fiscal year. That really speaks volumes, right? In terms of what is your number one most controllable thing? Well, there's two things. One is make sure you get every penny you're owed another dollar more from a compliance standpoint, and then judicial management of your most important, operating expense, which is salaries. The way we look at it here is, I call our scheduling department the checkbook of the organization. And because when you really think about it, every time they fill the schedule, or whether we're adding unit hours or allowing people on PTO and backfilling, all of those kinds of daily tasks associated with managing our schedules. If you're in charge of managing a schedule, you basically have the largest checkbook the company writes, your organization writes. And so really using your resources judiciously is one thing that you can do to make a change when you walk away from this webinar today, in terms of fully appreciating, your business and understanding those kinds of things. Matt, let's go ahead to the next slide. So, Jack Stout introduced us to the concept of supply and demand, and really two different types of supply and demand. One we call static, and one we call temporal. In this case, this is a great slide I love that Matt found. It's a McDonald's slide showing you if McDonald's decided to make the same number of hamburgers every hour of every day. So in this case, we're looking at the number of customers on the left axis, and on the horizontal axis is time of day. It shows the number of staff needed to produce. And if we basically produced the same number of burgers every day, even if we varied our staffing, it would have a tremendous amount of cost associated with it and very low margin potential. On the other hand, if we dynamically produce food, and this is kind of what McDonald's has done, based on consumer demand at the time, you're now able to lower your cost, of productivity and increase your profit margin. And so I used to work at McDonald's when I was a kid, and when I worked at McDonald's back in the 80s, we made a ton of hamburgers to make sure the bin was full, right? And they would sit there for a couple hours, and we'd throw them away if they weren't consumed. But the job was to keep the bin full no matter what. Whereas now when you go into McDonald's, they make everything on demand for the most part, right? And so huge shift in terms of making McDonald's more productive and more profitable. We'll take those same concepts and apply it to our business. So, having the hamburger bin full all the time would be, basically our station-based approach, where we have the same number of ambulances 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and versus, using a temporal approach or a high performance or a high value EMS system approach, where we would vary the number of resources based on demand. So here's a great example. This is a graph I believe Matt said from his system from many years ago, where we're looking at the demand in this case, which are the bars in the shaded area coming up from the bottom. On the horizontal axis, again, time of day, day of week. The left axis is the number of calls or number of ambulances that we're seeing in this particular EMS system. And then the line at the top, I believe, is a response time reliability as the day marches on, where they stand for that particular day. And then the lines here represent their supply chain of ambulances. And so that's basically the number of hamburgers they're making by each hour. In this case, it's ambulance unit hours compared to the demand being placed on the EMS system that you see below. So this is a varied approach, just exactly like what we see here with the hamburgers.
Yeah. So Rick, you come from a much different type of system. Talk to us about the complexities in a typically statically deployed system, some of the goals and objectives for that staffing, that service delivery, the all hazards approach, as compared to what Jonathan or I or Chip might do in our system?
So the first challenge is that dual purpose or dual role. So again, it becomes minutes of reliability or availability, and so that essentially there's time when you're covering dirt, and I don't think anyone's community wants to be referred to as dirt, but it certainly is a geographical posting that it doesn't provide a tremendous amount of flexibility, and the goal is typically to get into, if you leave your first due during the transport, is to get back to the first due as quick as possible so that the reliability for that geographical area remains as close to that parity as you can get. And when you mention that parity, that really is very difficult to explain to the average person, that they all pay into a kitty, that would provide coverage, but the expectation that if you moved away from where all the services are and intentionally into a rural area, that you would get the same amount of coverage as if you lived across the street from one of the urban stations. And it doesn't exist. It just means that the cost of getting your service is that much higher per call based on where you live. And so the challenge is there certainly to do that. And there is some flexibility when, as we start to drop coverage, where units will split districts and things like that, which is very similar to dynamic dispatching, but it's still at a much more pedestrian level than actually a system that's continuously moving and flexing based on the conditions of the number of available units. And that comes with a cost associated with it also.
It does. And I think there's value too. That I heard this term thrown out for the first time about a year ago. The concept, the difference between a multi-role provider and a single-role provider, right? The multi-role provider being a fire service model, a single-role provider being more like a third service or a MedStar or something like that, public utility model, or privatized EMS system, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. And there's a big difference between the two. I think clearly there's economic benefit in the multi-role system, especially as you go into the the rural parts of the community and where you have multiple missions that you're trying to do. The other thing you have to understand too is that the probability of events happening underneath each of these different models. What's the probability of multiple fires breaking out at one time in one geographic location in a service area? It's relatively low versus what's the probability of multiple EMS calls happening in a community within a certain geographic region at the same time. It's very high. And so you have to apply the right tool to the right job. And so in a rural environment, that station-based approach is really all you have to offer, because it's very difficult to predict, and people have a certain level of expectation. So using that multi-role concept makes a lot of sense, versus as you move into an urban, more dense area, that's where you can sometimes run into problems and challenges, especially in the station-based model, where certain stations are running a much higher UHU than others. And all the issues associated with it. Very similar kinds of problems you can have in a high-performance EMS system as well, in terms of impact on workload on employees and things like that.
So to give an example, at our system here in Fort Worth, weekday afternoons, 51 units on the street. Weekday, 4 o'clock in the morning, 33, 34 units on the street. We generate about 274,000 unit hours a year based on a relatively predictable call volume demand, low in the morning, early morning hours, peak in the afternoons. So we tailor, as you can see, our staffing. If we had to staff 51 ambulances 24/7, the number of unit hours that we would need to produce would be 447,000. So almost twice as many unit hours. I know, Chip, you threw out some numbers a minute ago in Richmond. What do you produce to match your call volume to your staffing, as opposed to if you did static deployment, static staffing, I should say, all year long?
So with our dynamic deployment, we know that to run our 70,000 plus calls at a 0.43 UHU, it's going to take us 123,000 unit hours. However, if we were needed to, have peak a day all the time, it's just under 200,000 unit hours we would have to put on the street.
Right. So in your UHU would probably drop and all sorts of things. So, okay, let's move quickly so that we can leave some time for Q&A. Then we got 2 more topics to discuss. Static versus dynamic deployment. So not only tailoring or having the type of staffing that you're going to do, fixed versus flexible, but now where do you put them? And a lot of systems now are using some predictive analytics. Here's an example of the Marvelous system that many systems use, where it literally predicts based on historical call patterns where the calls are going to occur based on time of day, day of week, time of year, etc. So in this particular case, you'll see there's what looks like a weather map, where the darker the color, it looks like a storm or rain going in that area. This is actually a system that says, hey, based on 2 o'clock Central Time on Mondays in September, here's where the calls have typically come from, and then superimposed over that are ambulances that are available, and then a 7-minute, in our system, a 7-minute drive time around that particular location. So the assertive use of deploying resources mobily so that you have essentially a blue polygon covering the majority of your anticipated call volume is something that we often refer to as system status management. Some are using the term dynamic resource management at this point, but being able to move those resources around to cover the anticipated call volume, because both the volume of calls and the location of calls will generally change throughout the course of a day or throughout the course of the week. So the aggressive use of move-ups, covering areas, being able to dynamically deploy some of these resources really helps quite a bit. Another big cost driver is how you staff. So whether you staff all your ambulances as advanced life support, meaning they have at least 1 paramedic. I know in some systems they staff dual paramedic units. But again, to John's point, to Rick's point earlier, that your payroll cost is your largest cost driver. Being able to have a paramedic on every ambulance is historically always been desirable. However, some systems look at this tiered approach, meaning about 40, 45, 50% maybe of most EMS systems have ALS interventions on a particular ambulance call. As we look at the narrowing of that margin between revenue and expense, is this now time for us to re-evaluate whether or not we want to have a completely ALS fleet, or do we want to look at maybe having a mixed fleet, some BLS units, some ALS units? There are some efficiencies. I know, Jonathan, you have a visceral thought about this. Talk to us about the benefits about all ALS or a tiered, having a mixed fleet, if you will, and then maybe I'll do a quick counterpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a purist when it comes to this. I'm a true believer in the all ALS system. When I say that, I'll define that as 1 EMT and 1 medic. I'm not necessarily in favor of a dual medic system for a variety of reasons, mostly due to a skills dilution. But I think Rick also has some different experiences with that, which is an interesting approach that he takes, and I want to learn more about that because you could convince me otherwise on that. But the difference really comes down to is a couple of things. One is that while the triage systems are great, and whatever medical triage system you use, they're only as accurate as the information you're told by the caller or the calling party. And oftentimes, I've seen studies done, when you look at a tiered system, how often, is ALS oversent in a tiered system and BLS undersent in a tiered system, where you end up having to send multiple resources, for an ALS rendezvous, for example, or you get on scene of a BLS call, an ALS call, and really the paramedic services weren't needed. The other issue we have is that is really comes down into revenue optimization, and a lot of people don't fully appreciate or understand this, but if you use a structured call-taking system that's been approved by your medical director in an all-ALS system, for example, you can't bill every call ALS, but you can bill every presumptive call in which an ALS ambulance arrived and a paramedic performed an ALS assessment as ALS, even if that patient was treated by the EMT in the back and no ALS intervention was done. And so going in a tiered system, quite honestly, in my humble opinion, the money's saved is offset by inefficiency in the system because you have to have more hours to respond to calls. Two, has some patient care impacting issues because I've unfortunately had to been an expert witness many times in tiered system type issues where there was a patient care problem because of the wrong resource being sent. And then also as a non-revenue optimization opportunity for the EMS organization. So, I'm still a diehard there. I don't know clinically in terms of, 90% of our patients, do they truly need, what's the impact that ALS has on them? I know a small number of our patients is truly where we save lives. The question is, does O2 monitor IV transport really do anything for us? And I think that the clinical evidence coming out is saying maybe not so much, but at least in terms of system design, that's where I stand currently.
And you mentioned it before that we took a little bit different approach in that we looked at what is in our system right now with the quality management program that's in place, what's the optimal mix that we get to achieve the lowest error rates. And our error rates for single and dual are pretty similar. And so our goal is 90% of the time to have two paramedics on the scene, whether one arrived in a fire engine or truck and one arrived on the medic unit or whatever the combination would be. We do know that when we get three medics on the scene that our error rates go up precipitously. And so it's while that I'm sure has a big training component to it, it's also just a scenario where if some is good, more is not necessarily always better. And it does really have an impact on skill dilution, especially if you're in a fire department that has a bidded system where people can remain, at what you referred to as the retirement stations, I believe, Matt.
John said that.
I know you said it with all due respect and love. Yes, I felt it.
Matt called you the EMS-based fire service. So.
Right.
Yeah, so I would still say that it's there's a lot of challenges to be made in that fixed system, and when you're at an all ALS in terms of transport, and then we also have the added dimension of what we're going to equip for what would be the first due unit, often a truck or an engine. Some in the Corps are BLS because they're there much quicker, and the medic units are there very quick also. And then in the places where the response times could be longer, then we put ALS on the first due.
Right. Makes sense. All right.
I find that. I'm sorry, Matt. Go ahead.
I was going to say let's move real quick to the last 2 points, John, so we can leave some time for Q&A. Yep. Is that all right? Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Let's talk about equipment. So equipment certainly drives cost. And if we look at an ambulance as really primarily a method of conveyance to the hospital, there are as many different ambulances as there are different EMS systems, perhaps, but the cost of the vehicle on the right is probably a little different than the vehicle on the left. And when you factor those types of things in, you just have to really ask yourself the question, am I being most cost efficient with the type of vehicle that I'm using? Is the vehicle that we're choosing to do a function, do we really need to have a $250,000 unit, or can we do it with a $150,000 unit? Because the cost to operate and purchase and operate those units tend to be different. In some systems where you have power cots, power loads, mechanical CPR devices, these are all equipment things that you'll add to your system that certainly adds to cost, not only for acquisition, but for maintenance. Yes, the ROI in some cases are very big on some of these things. So if you have power cots and power loads, you may have fewer back injuries, which are another cost driver, certainly on the payroll side and the workers' comp side. Same with mechanical CPR devices. When you apply those, the risk of injury to personnel is much less. CPR might actually be better. So outcomes and employee injuries may be less. So maybe some of these things do take this into account. So just think about the equipment that's in the ambulance as well as the service design and the delivery as being cost drivers. One of the things that we specifically wanted to highlight is that a lot of payers are beginning to really look at what it's costing and what they're paying for the services being provided. And we're going to leave this as perhaps a controversial thought, but here in Texas, our Medicaid office, as in some states across the country, do a GEMT cost reimbursement, and part of that cost-based reimbursement, or that the uncompensated care reimbursement, they analyze cost per service delivered. So this is the result from the 2017 cost report, which was reported in 2018. We're getting the 18 data that's being reported in 19 now. However, when our Medicaid office started looking at some of these numbers, they were asking things like, why are some providers' cost per call so much higher than other providers, and maybe we need to start looking at that. So for those of you who are still a little bit on the fence, you really want to start taking a look at how do our costs per X compare to other systems, because through the Medicare cost reporting process, through other GEMT processes, they're really beginning to ask those questions. And if you want your economic model is such where you're reliant on taxpayer dollars, the taxpayers more and more are starting to say, you know, maybe we need to find a more efficient system. So this will go back to a value conversation that we had in the very beginning webinar. We'll do it again as we go out through the course. But this is something that is really starting to be scrutinized pretty carefully by the payers. So it is important for us to know our costs. With that, and we'll do some final wrap up here in just a moment. But Melissa, let's turn the microphone to you. Are there any burning platform questions that have come through, one or two of them that you'd like us to address before we write out the answers and make them available on the website?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of questions from a lot of participants today on the appropriateness of response times, especially from those folks who are in rural settings where they have 2 to 3 hour transports. So could you address the appropriateness of response times?
You know, and let's do this as a lightning round. Each of us will get 15 seconds. There is very little evidence-based research that response times have any impact on the patient's eventual outcome. We rely on them too much as a quality measure when they are neither clinical or even operational. So I think we need to de-emphasize the emphasis of response times and really focus on the overall clinical picture of the system for the services being provided. Rick, how about you?
Amen to everything you said. I think as health literacy improves and people start to understand that that's not the gold standard by which you should measure all things, that we can start to have a renaissance of how we try to deploy our units.
John?
Yeah, I would echo everything you know, that's been said, and I honestly think that we have to study this much more because ultimately we need to have a good response when the really bad stuff, you know, happens, and be able to support that. But on a daily basis, you know, the need for an 8-minute standard, just because I think is going away, just because it's no longer sustainable and affordable, and not sure that it's needed. So.
Great. Melissa, another question? We'll take one more.
Yes. So the next question is about mixed responses. So it's, what is the best way to determine UHUs when mixed between 911 and non-emergency transports and 24/7 and peak hour units?
John?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different trains of thought on this. I tend to design the system where using an all hazards or an all hazards approach, meaning every ambulance can do everything. So an ambulance can go on a 911 call 1 minute and then do an interfacility trip the next minute. That's the value of an all ILS system. You know, if you're operating that way, you're looking at UHU as one is great. If you don't operate that way and you kind of run two businesses within your business, you'll likely have to look at 2 different unit hour utilizations. And in the, especially the discharge, you know, non-emergency transfer setting, the UHU I threw out there of a, you know, 3.4 to 3.8, 3.6 is definitely much higher in that world, just because the cost of readiness and different factors are, you know, for output is different in that space. So it depends on your system.
And again, these questions and others that we didn't get to will be published within the next week or two, and we'll let all the participants know when that's available. Melissa, do you want to tell us about the next webinar?
Yeah, so the next webinar will be October 30th at 1 p.m. The focus of the webinar will be the financial anatomy of an ambulance call. So we will take you and dissect a typical call from 911 dispatch through the receipt of reimbursement. So we hope that you'll all be able to join us.
All right, and President Decker, would you like to make any closing comments and close us out?
Well, just thank everybody for tuning in. There's going to be many more of these coming in the future, and we hope that you'll find them beneficial.
All right, and Melissa sent out the link, but for sponsoring this program, it would be great if you guys could take that quick Zoll survey that was sent out on the link, or will be available on the website. Thank you all for attending. We got you right at the 1 hour time frame, and we look forward to seeing you on October 30th, if not sooner. Have a great day, everyone.